Oh, okay, everybody. Can you hear me back there? Okay. All right, perfect. Just checking the mic. So I think we'll get started. Thanks very much for coming out this evening. Um, my name is Gene Bollinger, and with me is Cass Crost. We're from Weston and Sampson. We'll say a couple of words about where we come from and what we are up to as an organization, which might give you a little bit of a comfort level that we're in the right place, having this conversation with you folks tonight. This must be an old school because nobody wants to sit front and center here. Everybody's in the back or off to the side. So if you remember, the teacher always calls on people in the back row first. So be prepared, right? And be generous with your comments. So we're here on behalf of Mark Thorell and the town team that's been charged with pushing this initiative forward. We've been on the case for a couple of months. We've come up with what we think is some very telling and useful information. We don't know everything yet, and we rely on you folks to correct us if you see us with some information that's not quite spot on. But we wanted to take a little bit of time tonight and report out to you folks what we've been up to, what we've learned, and then sit back and pass the mic around and then listen to you folks some more. And the idea is that at a subsequent meeting, we'll come back with some more definitive recommendations, but we're not at that point here tonight. So we may give a hint as to some of the themes that we've been hearing about as we've been going through this process. And you folks may be able to put two and two together and say, well, that correlates to a complete renovation of this field or that field or this court complex. But again, we haven't really reached those conclusions yet. And it's through this interaction tonight that we'll begin to get closer and closer to arriving at some of those conclusions and recommendations. So a little bit about Weston and Sampson. We're a firm that's been around for a long time, 1899 actually. And Cass and I are both landscape architects, and we're both focused on working in the municipal realm, so cities and towns around the metropolitan area, and looking at their park, open space, sports, and recreation systems, basically. So we do have, I think, the benefit of bringing some strong perspective from some other communities around the metropolitan area, including some communities that demographically, geographically, so on and so forth, look a fair bit like Hingham. So we bring those credentials to bear as part of this ongoing process on your behalf. So the other parts of the interaction tonight, we're going to talk about basic project goals, just kind of reiterate those, and talk about the primary tasks that we've been charged with completing. We'll talk about project timeline, and then we'll have an open discussion. It's probably going to take us about 20 or 25 minutes to work through the presentation. Then we'll have a little bit more than an hour after that for comments about what you are seeing. So the basic project goals, complete an inventory and analysis of specific athletic fields and outdoor courts, which are tennis courts and basketball courts scattered throughout the community. Complete a public outreach and needs assessment process to identify and prioritize community needs. We'll talk a little bit more about how you arrive at a needs assessment for a community down a couple of slides from where we're at right now. But develop a strategic plan for improving existing facilities or constructing new facilities to meet community needs. From a whole host of perspectives, including quality of play, safety, accessibility, gender equity, is really an important part of the conversation in any community here in 2019. And outline a potential implementation process. So I think the town is moving in a great direction. There's been recognition that more can be done to satisfy the sports and recreation playing public. And really that's what this is all about. And that means from a program offering perspective, from a field and court venue perspective, and the quality of that facility, the number of the facilities, where they're located geographically, providing fair and equal access to all of the user groups in the community. And that's the schools, that's the community, sports and recreation programs, it's youth, it's adult, it's a whole host of folks that make up your community that are looking for positive outlets in the form of great facilities that perform well, that accommodate their playing needs. So those are some of the basic tasks. The needs assessment, how do you get to a needs assessment if we're talking about this master planning effort that we're going through together? Well, one way is by undertaking actual facilities inspections. So Cass and other folks from our team have visited every property in the community and recorded the physical conditions of all of those assets at the various properties. And those assets fall under recreation, they fall under schools, they fall under Board of Selectmen. So that, and we'll talk more specifically about the actual properties that we've been looking at. And we've toured these sites with representatives from the town. So it's impossible for us to see and understand everything based on one hour or 2 hour inspection. But we had representatives from town traveling with us to convey some of their thoughts and a fair bit of their institutional knowledge about each one of these assets that we looked at. User survey. There was a user survey that was available online. There was over 518 responses. There's some very good insight contained in those responses. The survey has been offline now for about a week or so. Less than. So we have dozens and dozens of pages of data that we have downloaded. And we're going to share some of that information with you tonight, but we're still compiling a lot of the information. For instance, there were a number of questions where people could write anything that was on their mind. So in some cases, we have 300 and 400 comments under that question. So we have to work through that to be able to summarize it to all of you folks in a little bit more detail. And then stakeholder meetings. So we convened a couple of days worth of meetings with various stakeholder groups. So, school related sports and recreation programs, community sports and recreation programs. And we probably had interactions with a dozen or so different entities.
Plus or minus, yeah.
Okay, he's here to keep me straight, make sure my numbers are right.
So,
and that was extremely helpful. That was about a half hour, 45-minute interaction with each user group. And we learned a lot about those programs, the number of users, the age of the users, the number of times they practice in a week, the number of times they play in a week. And I would say that almost all of them talked about the limitations of the Hingham system, if you will. And that means condition of fields, quantity of fields, the way programs and permits are issued, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk more about that. So that's really helpful in assessing the needs of a community. And then we're going to be developing this master matrix that identifies current capacity, quantity of assets, total usage, and that'll allow us to identify deficits. So in other words, hey, you've got this multi-use rectangular field. It's supposed to support 1,200 hours of use a year, but with the vagaries of New England climate, and it's getting worse in regard to heavy gully washing rainstorms, frequency, so on and so forth, and the numbers of users that are trying to make use, it's impossible to keep a field at a high performing level. So, and we'll talk about some of the ranges that we're going to be shooting for. And I can say 400 to 600 hours a season is what you will want to, you want to be within that window. That's the sweet spot for use of a rectangular multi-use field. And in certain situations, we're going to find that you're far exceeding that. And that makes it impossible to maintain that field at a high performing level and the level that you would come to expect. We'll talk a little bit about geographic distribution of where the facilities are located in the community. We look at that. It helps to inform the needs assessment. Trends and future needs. We're talking about things now that we weren't talking about 10 years ago. Pickleball is a perfect example of something that has cropped up in the last few years, and there's amazing demand for pickleball courts. You have some pickleball courts at this complex right here in Hingham. And where we're going to end up is a strategic plan, and it's going to identify a series of recommendations in regard to how to improve the existing assets you have, perhaps consider new construction of new amenities if there are severe shortages, and we haven't arrived at that conclusion yet. And also offer suggestions into how you operate, maintain, manage the assets that are part of the overall system. So these are the facilities that we've looked at, and these are the three different entities that I mentioned that the properties fall under the jurisdiction of. This is a little bit unusual based on our experience, and it complicates how permitting is managed, how maintenance is delivered, and so on and so forth. And we've worked within a lot of communities, just to give you a bit of a teaser in regard to what we might be covering as far as a recommendation, where jurisdiction might vary a little bit, but permitting, for instance, is centralized. And the delivery of maintenance of those facilities is centralized. So there's one entity responsible for that, those types of areas of responsibility, and not three or even more in some cases. So these are the basic properties that we looked at. These are the total numbers: multi-purpose rectangular fields, 24, baseball fields 3, Little League fields 11, softball fields with skinned infields, meaning no grass in the infield, 4, 11 basketball courts, 28 tennis courts. That's a lot of tennis courts for a community your size based on our experience. That's a great thing. And a skate park. And this is where the properties are located geographically. You can see that there's lots to the northern part of the community and the central part of the community. And as you get to the stream southern end, they tend to peter out in regard to the quantity of sports and recreation fields and courts within those areas of town. So with that, Cass is just going to run through some initial observations that we made during the inspections of the various sites. We're going to go through this fairly quickly. If people at the end want us to go back to a particular site and a particular slide, we're happy to do that.
That sounds good. Thanks, Gene. Yes, like Gene said, I'll try to keep this brief. There's a lot of properties and things to discuss, but really we just wanted to kind of highlight all of those different assets, all those different properties, but also the assets that are there. And then quickly, just some key takeaways that we developed while we were out there. So Bradley Woods, this is more of an informal space. In terms of the field space, there is a basketball court and a playground. It's informal. The challenge is the access here. So it's difficult to get to. There's parking on the street. You have to kind of walk up and around. And that leads to accessibility challenges as well. And you'll hear that accessibility challenge repeatedly as we go through these. Going to the Cronin complex, and I have this broken down by jurisdiction alphabetically in that way. It's just so if it seems like I'm jumping around, that's why. Cronin complex, this is out back here. And in general, there's just a general lack of accessibility. The fields are in fair to poor condition, I think. We've seen worse, we've seen better. The tennis courts are in fair condition. They do not have lighting. I know that's a sensitive issue in town. The basketball court is in fair to poor condition, trending more towards the lower end on that spectrum, just because of the cracking. The hoops are a little disoriented there. And the hockey court is in poor condition. There's holes in the wall from amazing hockey players ripping it through the dasher board. So it's a good thing. And if you want, I'm just going to go fast. We can kind of come back to these. So at Haley Field, designated a Little League baseball field, there's a long drive to the parking lot that's gravel. Again, accessibility in terms of the parking lot itself, but also getting to like those the spectator seating areas. Here you can see that they're just kind of floating in the grass, so it's difficult accessibility. It doesn't meet that code requirement. So something to think about. Other than that, though, the field is in pretty good condition, as well as the dugouts and other kind of the sport-related amenities. Hersey Field, the parking area here is a challenge, especially as you kind of try to go from the parking lot to the field itself. Again, there's no pathway that's there, and with a graded pathway, the smooth surface. Again, spectator seating is kind of floating in grass. The field itself is in decent condition, and all the amenities associated with it. There's a batting cage here, but back here it definitely gets a little wet, so it doesn't get used much beyond that. So that's something to think about in terms of opportunity of space. This is Whole Street Field. This is just generally informal. There's a new playground going in with some parking, but that's pretty much going to be most of it just informal play as far as we know it. And it gets wet. Crest Field, one thing here is the parking again, it's gravel, which brings accessibility challenges to it, as well as kind of pathway system throughout. And I want to say, while I'm thinking of the pathway system, as we go to all these different sites, that's one of those key elements that can be added to different sites that are existing that really help improve the system town-wide, because it helps create multi-generational use. So neighborhood people can actually go there, use it as a walking path, maybe a small running loop, things like that. So it's an easy win that you can do. Plus it's a good thing in terms of accessibility and things we should be striving for. The basketball court does have issues. I know it's a little bit small. A lot of the basketball courts here have short end lines. So basically the end line is actually on the grass. So there's no runoff space, safety space. It's one of those things you can easily kind of add that in to get that more up to speed. The Little League baseball field here, I know softball uses this a bit, and they have mentioned a lot of things where there's a lot of briars and weeds and things that they'd love to trim or have kind of cleared out. Also, trees are presenting issues in terms of that. And mosquitoes, they say, are bad here. And Margette's Fields 1 and 2. I hope I said that name right. I'm not quite sure. Okay. So this is, I believe this is Margette's Field 1, and there's your lacrosse wall ball here, parking lot here, with a drive that extends to an additional parking lot here and another field. Generally, the fields are in pretty good condition. There are some drainage issues that are present and prevalent, and things that we were discussed about. But it's only used for lacrosse. No other sports are really used that, so it's designated to those, which limits the hours of use and the demand, which helps with our performance. Again, accessibility to the parking lot's gravel, pathway system, et cetera, so on and so forth. Plymouth River Elementary. This is one of the more widely used tennis court complexes here. They're in generally decent condition. They have some cracking, but no real settlement or displacement issues. So it could be a pavement back in the day, 15 years ago, I believe, when they repaved those. So we're trying to talk about how, when we were out there, some methods of improvement and what that might be. We're still trying to kind of figure out what the right play is there. This is a Little League baseball field here. It's generally in pretty poor condition. The outfield fence is pretty ragged. There is a pavilion basketball court here. I love that you have a few of those here. I find those particularly awesome just because you don't see those very often, and it feels like it's an old movie I used to watch with Shaquille O'Neal that I really like. But those courts are generally in kind of fair to poor condition. Carlson Complex. This has a large rectangular field space here, which allows for rotation and things like that to help with goal mouth wear. There's a softball field, Little League baseball field. This is one of the better performing baseball and softball fields that are there. The rectangular fields are in pretty decent shape, but they do have drainage issues that could be improved. And the basketball courts are in good condition. Sometimes, just given the space here, the gentleman that works for Barker Basketball was saying that that could be a challenge when he's running a program, just kind of the distance between those two courts, having to run back and forth for the kids. In the skate park, we saw one kid ripping it up out there, but some small improvements to that could be done for the pavement. Lynch Fields, this is primarily for football and Little League. You can see there are existing lights here. I want to note that those are very low for kind of what sports they're lighting. And that has a whole host of, not issues, but just elements that it brings to table in terms of the glare and how the light angles more and it gets more in people's faces for neighborings. This is all now, I believe, condo development, so that'll be interesting. The field, there's definitely some grading and drainage issues at Lynch. The turf condition is also has some challenges. Also, you can see the orientation here between these two fields. You can see the outfield is kind of overlapping between those, so it kind of limits the ability to play those at the same time. So that could be potential layout improvements that might help relieve that kind of conflict and allow multiple games at the same time. Again, pathway system, there's really nowhere to go. I think there's some picnic seating that are just kind of out there floating in the field. But again, it's grandma's trying to get there. Sometimes she might have trouble making it over there. Powers Field. This is a Little League baseball field, but mostly used by the women's softball. It's in fair to poor condition generally. They don't really have too many problems with it, but it does have a challenging grade going up. And also in the back, they did just recently install some new ornamental fencing at the cemetery, which has some spikes on top, which is a challenge. They're trying to figure out how to negotiate that kind of safety issue. Also, the trees could be limbed up a bit. South Shore Country Club, basically it's just these three courts. We found them to be in pretty poor condition from a pavement surface condition, but also from a drainage condition as well. So those could definitely be improved. And then high school, this is a large complex, softball, baseball, synthetic turf. The old football field, which still has this rectangular field with a track around it. Shot put, informal, and then practice fields as they go around for seasonal based, lacrosse, soccer. Then there's the new softball field here that was put in a year or two ago. And then a baseball JV, and then a series of rectangular sport fields out here in this area. So generally, most of the fields we found to be in generally fair condition with no real significant grading problems. There are some moments and areas that do have grading issues and drainage issues that could be fixed. So when it rains, it's really there. You can kind of see where it starts to puddle here, which impacts field hockey and things like that. And then over here, it definitely gets a lot more wet for those fields that are rectangular over there on this, because there's a wetland area over here. The tennis courts are in fair condition. And then this is the middle school. This picture is not really representative of what it looks like today. The turf was actually, when we were out there, in pretty darn good shape. It doesn't look like it's getting used much. This is a Babe Ruth size baseball field, 70 to 90 hybrid. One thing to note here is this backstop is extremely short for baseball. Given the new school that's there, newish school, you kind of want to protect that. Also, the dugouts are lacking for the teams. But in general, the rectangular field space looked really good, and up here as well. And it's a nice nod to see this kind of the nod to that pathway system we're talking about in terms of maybe you can set up some spectator seating to get better access out there for folks. East Elementary, the fields are generally in like poor to fair condition. They're really just getting pounded by the kids at recess pretty much most of the day. Also, there's a grading issue here where these are smaller in terms of this fades down, goes down, and this is kind of a little plateau that ramps up, so it's limiting the field space that you could have there. And also, it also concentrates the use area, which also is detrimental to the turf condition. And then Foster Elementary. This is a Little League baseball field here. It definitely gets wet and has some drainage issues in major storms. The tennis courts are in fair to poor on the lower end of that spectrum. It's again one of those pavilion basketball courts that I really like. But the court's in okay shape, not that great really. And then at South Elementary, here is a fully skinned softball field here. I believe this has a short outfield on this end here. Generally, the field was in decent grading shape in terms of the grades. Drainage, we didn't really see too many issues prevalent when we were out there, but the skinned infield could use some work for sure. And this is a small informal field here that gets decent use, but it's in fair condition. And then there's a basketball court that's small again, similar to we talked before, but it's in decent shape. And then this is just a quick note to the public survey. We have wrapped all those items up. You can see that it closed on the 26th, which was last week. And I'm going to do right now, unless you want to chime in, is just go through just some of the key takeaways that we go through. So we're really kind of culled some of the highlights that we've found in the last few days, just to kind of give you, kind of wet your whistle to see kind of what information we're having here. So in general, how would you describe your overall experience? 61% of respondents say their experience needs improvement, which is a pretty significant number. And then, are existing facilities sufficiently meeting the needs? And 67% say that they do not. And it's mostly due to surface and drainage conditions. That was one of those where they were able to say, if not, why? Hundreds of responses. And you could just see the theme popping up again: turf condition, surface drainage, etc. And then would you rate the town's existing facilities? So 72% rated this, all the facilities basically 3 stars or lower in terms of meeting those needs. And then here we start to kind of dial into some specific properties and specific facilities. You can see the Carlson Complex rectangular fields, 81% rated that average to very poor. And then I'll just roll through those. The Little League baseball field, 69% said it was average or above average. Again, that's one of the better performing fields out there that we observed. Marquette's rectangular field, essentially 48% of the people that responded, just an interesting note that they don't use that. It's for a rectangular field space. It's a lot of people that are kind of passing by saying we don't use that field. And I think it's just because it is limited just to lacrosse. Lynch rectangular fields, 81% rated it average to very poor. The middle school baseball field, 42% do not use it, and I think it's because it's in that hybrid size, so it's not really meeting one need or the other in terms of a full-size field or a Little League field. The rectangular fields, again, 22% aren't really using that, and given the condition of those fields and the availability of those rectangular spaces, and given their condition, that's pretty high. Hersey Little League, 64% rated at average to below average. And then you'll see just kind of consistently, and even some of the pictures were evidence of it in terms of at all the schools, you can see that there's just a consistency in terms of between 50 and 60, 65, 70% of the rating is below average to very poor. And I think that's just starting to speak to those maintenance issues. And then going specifically just to the high school property, that's a large complex with a lot of facilities on it. The softball field, 72%. Average or below average. The varsity field hockey field, 78% average or very poor. I believe a lot of that has to do with some of the drainage issues and some of the grading that's there. The regulation soccer field, that's 78% was average or below average. And then you can see the whole slew of all those fields that were basically to the southwest. You can see generally 90% plus that are rated average to very poor. And I think that's people experiencing a lot of those drainage and grading issues where it's really not allowing people to get on those fields and use them as much as they want to. And then going to the courts in general, the South Shore Country Club courts, 80% average to very poor. Foster basketball courts, 95% average to very poor, trending more towards the below average or very poor. The tennis courts, the same. Plymouth River Elementary basketball court, mostly average to very poor. Tennis courts are holding pretty average at about 61%, and it goes to show there are some cracking, but they still get used a ton, and people are still decently satisfied with it. Elementary basketball courts in general, mid-80s in terms of average to very poor. And then at Cronin, tennis courts are 66% average to below average. I thought they were in pretty decent shape out there. And then the street hockey court, 73% say that it is average to below average. You could even say that 83% think it goes all the way to the very poor. But the dasher board definitely needs some shape, and the pavement surface could be cleaned up too. Crestfield basketball court, 85% average to below average. And then one big question here, how often does weather prohibit your use of athletic fields? And so 70% of respondents say that it either prohibits it pretty often or consistently, which is a pretty significant number. And again, that's leading to grading and drainage issues. Do these field conditions limit your use of these assets? And 67% said yes. And I think those two questions are kind of part and parcel, where if you're having those drainage issues, if weather's impacting you, then of course that's going to impact field conditions, which is going to impact your ability to use it. And then are the assets available at times when you need them? 26% of the respondents said no. So about a quarter of the people say, I want to get out there, I can't get out there. On the flip side, that's about 74% that say that they do. And then how would you rank the permitting and scheduling process? 58% were said it was just average. And I know there's only a select few that actually mostly engage in that permitting and scheduling process, so that might skew that a bit. And then would an additional or many additional synthetic turf fields help address those issues of concerns that you're experiencing out there? And 69% believe that it would help remedy those. And I think that starts to go to, they could play it in all this inclement weather that we're experiencing kind of on a consistent basis, and just really, people just want to get down the fields and use them, and the synthetic turf field allows them to do that. So as part of the stakeholder interview process, here's all the list of that we interviewed here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 16, I was wrong. I said 12. So 16 folks, and I see a lot of familiar faces in here today, so it's good to see that you've all come out again. And then as we talk about this, one thing that's still in the works that we're going through, and a lot of you folks have provided this information, is really kind of trying to figure out that usage matrix with those hours in terms of practices, games, how much of these fields getting used or not used. And we're still compiling all that data, so that's still in the works. But really, at the end of the day, we're trying to figure out the seasonal usage so we can say whether it's above or below. So it really starts to say, here's quantitative data that'll help you kind of understand and provide kind of the backing that says, all right, we are overusing these fields. That could be a contributing factor to what we're experiencing, as opposed to just qualitative data saying, oh, we think this. And then a strategic plan for improvements. Really, we're just kind of looking at all the different options that are available to us, and that could include new developed or reconfigured fields, taking a property, maybe the sports that are on that property stay, but maybe you can reconfigure those assets on the property itself to better maximize the space and improve people's experience that way. You could also adjust programming offerings, like Gene mentioned earlier, some of the maintenance concerns and things like that, and kind of centralizing those things. That's part of this strategic plan that could be effective here. And then also thinking like other ability to kind of expand, is there property where there's some available space that's not being utilized that you could start to tie into and really take advantage of it. Synthetic turf field footprints, what's the right number, what's the right amount, what are people comfortable with? And then that also all comes down to what is the capital ask for those things, and then how can those be kind of phased out over time so that you can have basically a roadmap forward, but then understand what the kind of fiscal impact is going to be coming up. And this is a tentative project timeline, so we are still kind of working this out, but you can see here's where we are today. We've been pretty consistent and kind of chugging along since September. And right now we've kind of have all the information we have now, I think, with the public survey done. Now we're in the synthesizing process where we're bringing it all together. So I think we're going to start moving more quickly in terms of developing some concept plans, some ideas, and conversation in terms of what is the right moves and what are the recommendations to do. And then we can start to create graphic plans for those and then start to implement that into what that would be in terms of an action plan and a capital plan and things like that. And so that's it. Basically, we want to use this as another listening session. I think it's an important tool to hear again, or for the first time, some of these voices to understand. So we open it up.
Yes. So my guess is there's probably not a lot of surprises in a sense, that what we're confirming is that field conditions are stressed and user groups are stressed out because of it. So, we heard from the stakeholder interactions in particular about lots of events needing to be canceled, postponed, seasons cut short, not having appropriate venues to support practice in order for kids to prepare for various games and so on and so forth. And it's not unusual, I'll say also. It seems like at first blush, there's a lot of locations, there's a lot of fields, there's a lot of courts We may learn that some fields are only used 200 hours and say, well, why is that not in better shape? Well, the fact is it may be only used 200 hours because it's in lousy shape to begin with. And a lot of the fields were constructed a long time ago, decades ago. And we know a lot more about how to construct fields properly today than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So if you're going to allow that maximum of 600 hours of use, it's best to have a field that was constructed properly with strong drainage, with good root zone growing media, and with proper maintenance delivered to the upkeep of that facility. And I will say, and we don't really have a position on this necessarily, but a lot of communities, because of the vagaries of our weather, spring's becoming more unpredictable, fall's becoming more unpredictable, weeks of seasons being lost, that the recipe to get the amount of footprints necessary to support the desired level of use is a couple of synthetic turf fields, because those can be used 2,000 hours a year. They can be used 5 minutes after a 3-inch rainstorm. And they can support a myriad of different types of uses. So in a lot of communities, that is part of the recipe. If you can afford to maintain natural turf fields, at I don't want to say premium, but in a condition that allows for a high performing event to occur on that venue, then that's a great thing too, without the need for synthetic turf field. It's a lot of communities around metropolitan Boston seem to be land poor, don't have enough footprints, and therefore they consider the synthetic turf field option.
So I have a kind of a question.
So we all have to use the microphone so our friends at home can hear us either later or next week or whenever.
It's sort of a question and a comment. First of all, when I look at your survey, when you talked about the schools, you'll notice that a lot of it was didn't use the facility. Well, obviously, the people who were filling out the surveys don't use the school facility because it was most likely, parents of sporting groups or rec people, et cetera. And again, not that that's a problem, but one of my big questions is the fact that, and we've talked about this a little bit, and again, I'm the chair of the rec department. School fields in this town are run by the schools, they're managed by the schools, they're permitted by the schools. Therefore, they only get funded if the school has the money to fund them. You guys are the experts as to how you're doing this or finding this working in other towns. Unless the schools decide not to educate kids anymore and decide to put all their money into fields, we'd have the greatest fields any place. But unfortunately, that's just not the case. And I don't think any of us want them to take away their funds from schools. We want to see the fields taken care of to the best of the ability of the townspeople, but not to take it away from the school budget. So can you comment on that? Because Hingham isn't different than any other community, I'm sure. Can you comment as to, have you seen another community take on? We have wonderful schools, wonderful fields at those schools, but they're not being utilized to the end, being maintained to the perhaps the best way they could be because the funds aren't there. Do you have some kind of recommendation or something you've seen other places?
Well, I can take a cut at it. We haven't arrived at specific recommendations yet for Hingham, but certainly we have observed in many other communities that the responsibility for the maintenance and upkeep of the field asset at the school property is being managed by somebody outside of the school department. And that brings a level of consistency and a level of professionalism that is not offered typically through a local school department. And I'm not trying to diss anybody. It's, the focus is on what happens in the inside of the walls in the school and educating the students. And a lot of times the person power is not there. The financial resources are not there. The equipment, the materials are not there to maintain those assets at a high performing level. And then also from a permitting perspective, this central source that a lot of communities have established to manage permitting of sports fields and courts and the like understands that what happens at the school in regard to their recreation programming, their athletic programming takes precedent. And that's always accommodated. But typically, there are significant windows that are available where those fields or those courts get permitted to the general residential population. So a lot of that's kind of been extracted from the responsibility of the folks who are running the schools. And there's one other conundrum too in Massachusetts. We're great at renovating the buildings and building new buildings, schools, and all of those things that are really integral, like the access drives, the parking areas, the lighting. But the way we fund school improvements in Massachusetts often leaves courts, fields, children's playground out of the equation, and the local community on the hook to raise those funds separately from the match that they get from the state for the actual building improvements and those essential site improvements that go with the building. So it's not unusual in lots of communities where this is a gap, and communities have had to figure out how to fund and manage the assets at school properties at a higher level. Did you have a follow-up?
I guess my follow-up would be, because we've got two beautiful brand new schools in Hingham in the last several years, both who got left with not great fields, and we're about to do another school probably in the next year or two. And, so what do we do? Because I think everyone in this room would agree, this is a perfect opportunity to make sure when this beautiful new school is built that we don't leave the fields the way they are. This is the opportunity where the money is being spent and construction is happening. How do you get the town to commit? Is there a secret sauce or a secret something that says the town, here we've got this opportunity, we need to go all the way? I mean, these kids need the fields, they need the courts, and this particular school has all of those. So I don't know, can you guys just wave a magic wand and make it happen?
Well, the point is that communities are having to figure it out, and that's where you're at right now. So kudos for going through this process, because I think we can all be a little bit more enlightened. And this is an opportunity to build support, build understanding of how we're going to deliver higher performing fields and courts here in Hingham. A really quick example, in Wayland, west of Boston, clearly, built a absolutely beautiful high school. Not $1 went to the sports and recreation facilities outside of the school. So we were retained. We did a master plan for all of the outdoor fields and courts. And it was a whole separate initiative. It went to town meeting for authorization. They're undertaking about a $7 or $8 million program at the high school now, renovating track, field, courts, girls softball, and so on and so forth. So they had to figure out another way to do it. Those assets, by the way, are not managed and maintained by the school department. They're maintained by a central group actually operating within the Department of Public Works. It's a park and forestry group with particular expertise in that area. So Ray, you were looking to say something.
Thanks. So Vicki, you're absolutely right. But I would say it's a much larger issue. It's not just the schools. It's the town. It's your department as well. We don't, as a town, maintain our facilities properly, and we haven't for a long, long time. It's just a matter of, as a town, deciding from a budgetary perspective that we're going to commit more dollars to maintenance and upkeep of our facilities. There's at least two former school committee members in the room tonight, and I can tell you that both of us are intimately familiar with the budget process and how much gets allocated for what. And maintenance is a small fraction of the school budget. It needs to be larger for sure. I would say it's always been fascinating to me that as someone who's been involved in the schools, but also been involved in youth sports programs, and has kids who have been in the programs, that we as a town, whether it's the selectmen or rec or the schools, charge these independent groups to use the facilities, and then we don't maintain them properly. We don't give them the value for that rental fee. And in many cases, we leave it to those groups to maintain the fields themselves. Baseball is a perfect example. I, as a baseball parent, for years prepared infields for play and dealt with flooding and other issues. I think it's a significant town issue that we need to approach from a 30,000 foot level in terms of, we have these facilities. You talked about the new schools and those new facilities. You're absolutely right. Two of the things that we built at the high school were a new baseball field and a new softball field, but then we didn't maintain them properly. And as a result, they haven't performed well. We've now apparently figured out how to maintain them a little bit better, and the performance is improving. It's still not optimal. It's still not what it was intended to be 6 years ago when we built them, okay? Same thing at the middle school. The grass fields at the middle school have only been online for 2 or 3 years, and that's because they needed to grow in for years after the school opened 5 years ago. The you'll call it a baseball field because it's got an infield. It was designed as a 50-70 baseball field, specifically because the users at the time said, this is where we're going in terms of size of field for this age group. So this field should be designed for that size. So, you try to engage the public, and then now, 5 years after the fact, turns out maybe that wasn't the right size. And now they're trying to do something to convert it so it can be used in a different way. That's fine. I just think we need to take a better holistic look at how we maintain our facilities, how we build our facilities, how we design our facilities, who the intended users are going to be, where the money for maintenance is going to come from in the long term. I know the school committee is upstairs right now in a meeting, and in January they'll start looking at the new budget. Well, folks in this room want to go to some of those budget meetings and say, put more money in the maintenance budget for the schools. Enough people say that. Those are your elected officials upstairs. If enough people say that, you can make it happen. That's the only way to get things done in this town. And it's enough people have to stand up and say, we're tired of it. That's what I have to say.
Hi, my name is Vincent Murray. I've been involved in youth baseball for approximately 35 years, coaching Legion baseball for about 22 years and Babe Ruth baseball for 10 years. Most all of that has been at Cronin Field, so that's the field that I'm most familiar with. And just make sure everybody understands there's tremendous usage of those fields. During the spring, you have the freshman high school team using it, the junior varsity high school team using it. You have Babe Ruth using it. It's used virtually every night and almost every afternoon during the spring. And then in the summer, you have Legion and Junior Legion using the fields. And then you have the Babe Ruth travel teams, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. So again, it's used virtually every night throughout the summer. So there's tremendous usage of the field. The problem is that there have been some difficulties as Jim had mentioned, in keeping up the maintenance of the field. I know it was rated fair to poor in your evaluation. And I'd just like to say I appreciate the time and effort that you people are putting in Weston and Sampson, because this is so important for everybody in the town, especially the youth and all the athletes within the town of Hingham. And all you have to do is look at the results from some of the high school programs. We were rated one of the top team, I think the top team in the state for sports programs and success and excellence. So it's really important. And when you look at Cronin Field, you see that the sign Cronin Field is really worn and needs to be replaced. I talked to Bill Cronin today, whose father the field was named after. He's spending approximately $1,000 on the monument to take care of that himself. When you look at the batting cages, those are really in deplorable condition right now. The dugouts could use some work itself. And I don't know if the track is in consideration or not, but when you look at the track, the cinder is all overgrown with grass, and it really is not a usable track over there as well. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. The scoreboard out in left field makes a tremendous difference when there's a game going on, that people could come in at different times, see the score, realize what inning we're in, realize what team is ahead. It really makes a big difference. And everybody in the South Shore recognizes that there have been really two special fields throughout the South Shore over the past 50 years. One has been Adams Field in Quincy, the other is Cronin Field in Hingham. And Cronin Field hasn't really kept up with the type of field that it was in the past. And what I'd like to see is anything that could be done to bring it up to the level that it was at before would really be important for the town, and we appreciate whatever you could do in that regard.
Can I just say one thing? As the chair of the rec department, because I know this is being taped for people at home, and very often people who pay their taxes don't realize that not one penny goes to the rec department to take care of fields. I think that they think that there's money going into some fund to take care of and maintain fields, and as Ray has spoken about the school department, it's not there. We don't have money for recreation to put any money into the field. So basically the fields are maintained through permitting dollars, or whatever youth sports can do. Believe me, I appreciate them. We appreciate them for what they do, but it's not a case that people are paying for it in their tax dollars and that it's just not being used. So I think the fact that it's being taped, we want to make sure that people at home know that. Thanks.
Thank you both.
Yes, Ron Hutchins. I agree with Mr. Murray about the way that the Cronin Field is taken care of. I myself take care of the Cronin Field roughly for from the middle of April till the end of September, trying to maintain the infield, line it for every team that he mentioned. Babe Ruth, Legion, Junior Legion, Babe Ruth. I'm there every day. In regards to other fields, the high school field, I know the school department and the town voted umpteen $1 million to redo the fields over there. I played at the high school field in 1965, and it hasn't changed one bit. The only thing they've done over there was put a fence down along the sidelines, and there's no permanent fence. There's no dugouts. As far as safety, you're there for a high school baseball game and there's a tennis match going on. A lot of times, a lot of them kids in the tennis courts are getting hollered to watch out because there's a ball coming over. In my estimation, I'm not an expert, but the field should have been moved. And if you want an opinion on where to move it, I can give you one. If you put up the high school fields on your board, if you go into the center of the bottom, down over a little more to your left. Yes, see that little shadow spot right there? You take that field and put it back there, you're going to eliminate balls going into the other field. You can put in a regulation size field with a regular fence and dugouts, which should have been put in the other field. And you will have an extra space up there where you can put more soccer fields or lacrosse field or whatever else type of field that you can use up there. And I also noted that you said that there's 3 baseball fields. Well, the field across the street that's a regular baseball field can't be used probably 5 nights out of the week, because if you have soccer games going over there, the balls are going in there. So when you say there's 3 fields, there isn't 3 fields. There's only 2. And the field up at middle school, which is 50-70, was supposed to be for a Cal Ripken League team. That's useless because there's no Cal Ripken teams around here. So either make it a Babe Ruth size field, 60-90, or make it a Little League field, one or the other. Or a softball field, but it's not a 50-70 field. It's not used right.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elliot Sherman. I live in Hingham, and I have a little bit of history on these fields. And I can tell you, one of the things that doesn't happen anymore that used to happen a lot is the volunteerism of parents and community groups. Haley and Hersey were small Little League fields when we started. It was a group that volunteered to rip out the old brick cinder block dugouts, volunteered to put the roofs on the fences that the Recreation Commission paid for, and put up a new scoreboard and dressed up the fields. Those fields are still minor league fields in size. They don't pass the size dimension for Little League. So when middle school was being built, we thought we'd build one that had the Little League size dimension, which is something that 12-year-olds who use aluminum bats that can hit a ball 250 feet need. And that's a middle school field for middle school players. It wasn't designed to be necessarily a Little League field or necessarily a Babe Ruth field. The high school field, when they rebuilt that, they put dugouts in, but no foul poles and no roofs on the dugouts because nobody accepted the donation that people wanted to make to put roofs on the dugouts, even though the MIAA rules and the Major League Baseball rules require roofs on dugouts, because if a foul ball came and hit me, the coach, in the head, I'd be a little upset. And the rain and the sun and all the other protective devices that we don't have. When Lynch was built, it was a football field originally and two little minor league baseball fields. It was all asbestos-laden dirt, and they extracted from the developer an agreement to put those lights in. But the compromise was that the lights were not going to be above 50 feet, so the neighbors wouldn't have glare into their house. And they came with light meters and measured them all. They should have been 70 or 80 feet tall, like expressway height lights, but the neighbors wouldn't tolerate it. So the compromise was lower lights. Also, the compromise there was because both football and baseball needed fields, it would be a combined field, which is what you see in a lot of sites. You don't have any dedicated field except the lacrosse field. So you get these mixed up versions, so it can be used multi-season. You get football off and on, and then you get baseball in the rest of the season, or the spring and summer seasons. But that's why there's no permanent fencing. That's why the irrigation work doesn't work exactly the way it was designed. That's why the lights shine differently in different spots, because they're supposed to light up baseball fields and football fields. So there are 3 banks of lights, for instance. Now, Lynch was a little better because when we talked about that, the selectmen had put the bond out for the DPW field, and they needed the support of the athletic community to build the fields. That was a bomb area. That entire field was an old Navy depot that was used for nothing that we were ever going to use it for. It was given by the Navy to the town with the stipulation that it be used for recreation and education. That's what it was. So the town engineer and I and a few other people sat down and designed a baseball field solely for baseball. They wouldn't let us put lights in it, of course, but at least we got a field that was of the proper dimension, that had dugouts, that had a batting cage, and the softball field contiguous to that were nice, and they're still the perfect size. On those fields, you can also adjust them. They can be made for use by older children or younger children. You move the mound a little bit, and there's a little bit of flexibility, but you don't have to adjust it between sports. So when you have a football field that's half a year baseball and half a year football, you get a whatever it is, buffalo ball field, right? You get the turkey chicken, and that's what happens. So everything's cut short, and they just shave a little bit off so you don't need 2 fields, or you compromise between constituencies and you get multiple use fields. But none of them are working right. The 2 fields, but you could make one for each and probably get the result that you wanted a little better. So in the planning, as you go down this road a little, maybe think about designing one for one purpose and another for another purpose, and making it that way, not giving 50 cents to each kid and hoping that they both spend it in the right place. Thanks.
Good comments again. Thank you very much.
Hi, Mark Wilkin, Hingham's girls softball. I just had one question regarding when you get your proposals and recommendations together. Do the stakeholders at that time have an opportunity to review those, vet them, and add any comments as to whether or not, you even address, the various stakeholders' concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the intention. This needs to be, a plan that is really specific to the needs of this community. So we envision establishing some recommendations and vetting those recommendations widely and getting people to support them, say, hey, that's not exactly right, that needs to be tweaked, and so on and so forth. So this really has to be a plan that works for this specific community, meets your needs, can be supported, and can be used to, identify potential capital improvement plans, potential adjustments to how fields are permitted and how they're maintained, and so on and so forth. So absolutely, positively, and we look forward and will embrace any of the feedback that we get from people to make this the right plan for this community. And then we'll go back.
If I could just add one more comment about what Vicky had said, that the Recreation Department has really done so much with so little over the past 25, 30 years that I've been involved. And I know we never would have been able to play as many games as we did without their help and assistance. But there just comes a time when they need some financial resources, and that's what we hope that you'll be able to help us with.
How you doing? I'm with the Hingham Little League, and there's a couple of representatives of the league here, and we're certainly one of the groups that has to put a lot of their own time, a lot of volunteer time into maintaining the fields. A lot of that is because of just the makeup of a baseball field. The fact that it has a dirt infield typically makes it more difficult to maintain. The rec department, who is funded, as they mentioned, there's no funding that comes from the town, that comes from the taxpayers. They do the best they can, but they were given a dented car, really, and they're trying to keep it going. And the fact that these fields, from a construction standpoint, were not constructed properly to begin with, the drainage is the number one problem, as you'll see across any of the sports, any of these fields. If that stuff gets taken care of, it makes it easier for the rec department to maintain them. It makes it more efficient for them to deal with it. Putting in more turf fields allows them more resources to put towards things that really have no other alternative except people out there working on the fields. They do the best they can, but a good investment, which is clearly what this whole process is for, investing money into these fields initially to make them easier to maintain down the road is really I think the goal across here. And I think that what you guys are doing is really important, and taking everybody's, as Little League has had a meeting, as just about every sport has had meetings with you gentlemen about this, and got our feedback, our input, our usage, washout, rainouts, the amount of time that we volunteer to maintain these fields on our own. And all that together gives you the full picture. And I just hope that people in the town understand that, and that understand that you are here viewing the entire town as a whole and taking everybody's recommendations and needs into consideration, and to basically put together a master plan of what is going to benefit the town in the long run. Some of these fields, I'm assuming, our kids won't even see them. There'll be 10, 15 years before maybe this whole thing takes place, but it's important to put the time and the effort and the money into it now, so that we leave the town better than we found it. So
One thing, just kind of picking up on what Jeff said, a lot of towns that you visit, they'll have centralized sports complexes, and what's helpful there is it's one parking lot, multiple kids practicing, playing at the same fields. Also, centralized maintenance, which brings the cost down and you don't have to travel. If you look at the map, our fields are spread around everywhere, and then you owned by three different entities, which complicates it further. Um, how much thought has been put on other areas? I'm thinking about the driving range next to the high school. I've heard about some land behind Pilgrim that the town may own. Like, how much thought has been put around centralization of fields as a solution? Because I did not see you guys identify anything outside of what our current fields are for, opportunities or assets, as you called them.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. And we would welcome any thoughts that people have about lands that might be suitable for development of fields and or courts. Now, I say that not having arrived at the conclusion that we actually need more real estate. And as Cass was suggesting, it might be more efficient arrangement of facilities on the properties that you have. It might be achieving better conditions overall throughout the system. It might be the addition of a synthetic turf field or two. So we're not ready to say that you don't actually have enough footprints to work with, but that could be a conclusion. And one of the things I think we realized, particularly in the stakeholder interactions, is that the numbers of kids participating in some of these sports is just, it's skyrocketing. So that's a really, really great story also, is that this is a community that's strong in sports. It is a community that emphasizes outdoor recreation and activity, and that's all good stuff. But with numbers surging in a lot of the different programs, you need to have the venues available to support that surge and use. And I'm not sure you mentioned or not specifically, but there are some programs that aren't even accommodated within the confines of the town of Hingham. They have to find venues outside of the community to support their needs. So we're going to get there and we'll reach a conclusion whether you have enough land. And if you don't, then it's like looking for other properties that might be suitable. Typically, you start with other public lands because they're affordable. You already own them, they're in your custody. But, in unusual cases, you look beyond that. But sometimes the cost of land acquisition is so great that becomes more difficult. So, but I think it's a great point, and we will be addressing that as we get deeper into this in the very short term, by the way.
To the point, my name is Bill Crean. To the point you made, one of the things that routinely gets brought up in town is that 78% of the students at Hingham High School participate in at least one sport. We're also fortunate that this year, girls field hockey at the youth level was started. A couple years ago, they started a varsity MIAA rugby team. So, to your point, we're adding sports. And the other thing that I think is important, people here may know it, but the people at home may not know it, is that the parents of this town are the backbone because there are multiple booster groups at the high school that are funding through fundraising additional teams so kids don't get cut. And it's not all field sports, but there's a real emphasis that our community understands that our children do much better when they're active and they're playing a sport academically, socially, and just overall for the community. We're better off by that. And not to mention just having experienced the lights and the turf at the high school, it's a true community event whenever they have the sports up there because it's not just the varsity athletes that play. All the youth teams are getting night games. And you go up there, and it's not just the parents of the athletes; it's younger families, it's older people in the community. It's a true source of socialization as well as pride in the town, just competing. And so I just think it's important to note that we need to look at this as it's not just about playing sports. There's a lot more to this, and we all truly benefit. And we will truly benefit if we have the facilities to continue to maintain what I think we as a community think's important.
Super, thank you. Other thoughts or comments?
One other comment. I have to say, one of my takeaways tonight, which I probably because we spend so much time talking about fields and athletic facilities, I never realized that I don't think there's one slide that doesn't say our accessibility and amenities don't need improvement at every field. And we're so busy making sure the field is at least as best it can be, we forget about the accessibility. And I'm just realizing so few of our fields have decent accessibility, except to maybe the kid who's, 7, 8, 9, or 10, who can run right out there on the field, but everybody else. And I mean, it's amazing how that has been so overlooked for so long. And now I'm hearing dugouts without roofs, things like that. I mean, just to me, it's just a long time coming that we need some of these improvements. So big plan ahead.
I think when you're looking at significant capital expenditure to upgrade a facility, you have to look at those other value-added items that maybe don't cost a lot, but build additional support and make the facility more inclusive and more multi-generational, and so on and so forth. Cass mentioned simple pathway systems that allow people to get from a vehicle out to the recreation facility. And oftentimes that can be in the form of a loop path that connects to multiple facilities. And then that loop path becomes a place to get out of a town right of way and out of the fray and into a public park or open space asset where you can run a quarter mile around the loop, or half a mile around the loop, or so on and so forth. So I think as we develop recommendations that are property specific, we'll look at those additional value added items that can help make everything perform better from a multi-generational standpoint.
How you doing? Just a couple comments, just to piggyback off of some of the comments. But in terms of neighboring properties and development, especially down at Lynch Field, now you're seeing a developer come in and building around it, and it's causing accessibility issues where you're walking down the sidewalk and it's like a 4-foot drop into, sort of like a swimming pool almost at Lynch Field now because the sidewalks are so high, and improvements there. I mean, are you guys looking at stuff like that? Are you guys evaluating, what was planned, how that was implemented, whether the developer put in money that needed to be put back into Lynch Field, or, any other properties or locations of fields? But, that's important where, somebody comes in, changes, the area around it, and then they leave us with the ticket to pay, for the lighting that we put in, whether it was, 4, 5, 6 years ago, that's maybe inadequate now that they have lighting that's coming onto our property, those types of things. And then second, in terms of the recreation department, in your feasibility, I mean, other recommendations, are you going to have other types of items as, you see it done this way in other towns where the recreation department takes care of all fields, whether it's, split up a different way, how that is evaluated across the board?
So, Cass, I don't know if you want to comment at all. The first question about the impacts of that private development on the park and open space asset.
Yeah, so in terms of our assessment, we are taking a look around and kind of seeing all the impact in terms of the adjacencies that are there. Those are all things that we do weigh in. And in terms of things that we can improve, that's where we start to say, what would make this the best property in general? So if it incorporates kind of improving some of those, the drainage ditch or swale or whatever it is, that would be something to consider, because maybe if you kind of reconfigure the drainage pattern and plan, it actually buys you more space or more safe space as well in terms of just that type of issue. So of course, we're definitely taking in all those different things in terms of on the field adjacencies, also access from multiple places and things like that. So it's all part of the equation.
I think you're mentioning specific negative impacts that a private development potentially had on the field space.
Well, yeah, and Lynch, they definitely have the lighting. So, and then the grading issue now where where, their drainage may come onto our property and they have all these users from their facility, and how are they contributing? And, within the town, I'm sure it was permitted some way whereby they had to allocate dollars, and how are those dollars getting to us in order to implement those into the improvements of the plan. So, I think that's important. If those things are being done, I think that should be, mentioned in the study where, if there's developments around it, that, there needs to be consideration of, dollars being put into the fields. It's back to the middle school situation where, you're building this brand new facility and you are stuck with a baseball field that, you're not really using. Maybe, it was intended to be used differently and it just didn't work out that way. But I think just more thought into it and making sure, in the longevity of it all, that the usage is being used for what, everybody thinks is, most critical.
I mean, I think that's what we're taking from that global perspective, is to understand what the usage is and what the demands are, and then how we can apply those to what's existing and see whether that is being sufficient or not. I do think that those are some of the elements that we have to be mindful of in terms of not just current existing use, but also future use, to see what that might be. We're thinking of trends as well as equity as well. Gender equity when I say that. So those are all part of the things we're trying to figure out and to do. In terms of the dollar amounts and allocating, maybe there's pots of money that might be available. That's where we look to the town to have that information. That could be something that we would absolutely fold in to the conversation. Bags of money. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so when you're talking about private developments, and I don't really know the specifics of the case you're talking about, we can certainly look into it. Communities refer to it as linkage, as mitigation, so on and so forth. And sometimes funds from a private development will go towards improving an intersection or improving a section of roadway. There's no reason why they couldn't go to improve a park or open space asset either. I don't know a lot about how that works here in Hingham. We can certainly ask the question and be a little bit more informed about that. So.
I think it's important, to the extent you all have data points on higher lights, new technology, and light spillage, that makes its way into your analysis, especially if Lynch fields are identified for synthetic or redevelopment, because there's going to be a battle there. And I've talked to a number of people about this, and the height of the lights, and Elliot mentioned it too, that the spillage and the age of these lights, it's going to be a lot more light on the neighboring properties than it's going to be if we throw proper height and proper technology lighting there. So to the extent you guys have any data points with other towns, I'd really like that to be involved. And lights on Carson Field too.
Yeah, I think I'll be right there, sir. Just one second. I think it's ironic because the current state of technology is such that lighting for sports fields tends to be taller. It tends to be in the 60, 70 foot range. It might even be taller than that in certain situations. And it's actually less impactful in regard to creating disturbance and inconvenience to abutters because of the state-of-the-art lighting. It's very directional. You get within 15 or 20 feet of the limits that are being lit, and you drop off very quickly to 0 foot candles. So the lower the light, the potential for it to be really impactful from a glare perspective. You also need way more poles. You need way more lights, and that's impactful from an aesthetic standpoint. So I think, there's a conversation to be had there. There are some benefits to considering fewer but higher light standards for a whole host of reasons, and I think we'll be prepared to report on that as part of this effort. This gentleman had his hand, and then I'll go back to you. Okay.
Thanks. I just want to actually compliment you. That's exactly what happened. There were lighting engineering plans for Lynch. There was an engineer that drew a set of plans and aimed them all in a specific direction. The high school, when they lit their fields, had different engineering, different science. By then, sound was directed right into the ground, so it didn't affect the neighbors. Lights was the same thing, 70, 80 foot poles, and the technology has changed. But that's a multi-million-dollar project. Also, the linkage for Lynch was the town was able to extract from the first developer, Hastings, that built those first set of condos, all the improvements that went to that field. I think they just got a fire truck for the new one. I don't know, Ray, you might know that one. Or they got windows or something for the, I don't know what came out of the new developer, but there is linkage. They always try it, but sometimes they don't get much out of it, or they get something out of it, but not, the fields are the last piece, like any landscaping that, in any development. And the town itself paid for Carlson because that was linked to the town's own DPW facility that they wanted to relocate there from 5 different locations that it was spread around town. And also on the idea of centralization, I don't think this town has enough roadways or parking spots. When we built the parking spots at Lynch, we thought we were going to be able to handle the crowds. And now I go up to Stop and Shop, and you go both sides of the street lined up and down around the corner on a field on a Friday night, which is wonderful. But I don't know. I mean, nobody anticipated the car volume that would come with all those children. So 2 parents, 2 cars, and then somebody does else. I don't think you're going to be able to centralize. I don't think there's one spot in the town that doesn't have water abutting it and something else that's ever going to allow us the freedom of making that kind of a land use that's even publicly available, whether we could pay for it or not.
Bruce Thompson, Recreation Commission as well with Vicky. One of the things you alluded to earlier is what's Weston and Sampson's experience as to what entity within the town is paying for the maintenance of this? Is it Tree and Park? Is it Recreation? Will that be in your findings too? Because that, you alluded to it earlier, and I mean, that's the $10,000 question is, who's paying for it? We understand centralization of permitting, but what entity within the town is footing the bill? The taxpayers are footing the bill, but what entity within the town is responsible for the field conditions, the maintenance?
I think we'll definitely cite some precedents in some other similar communities, as I mentioned. And our experience is user fees are not sufficient to maintain all of the assets at the level that you would desire. So, and it probably comes from a multiple pots in many different communities. Some may come from the school department into that central pot of money that's put towards the maintaining of the fields and the courts in the community. Some might be from user fees. Some might be from a separate allocation operationally to that community's Department of Public Works, to the Park and Forestry Group, or so on and so forth. So I think we'll be prepared to report out on probably a half a dozen similar communities, and what that dollar value looks like, maybe based on a per capita or land area, something like that, so that we can relate it to the amount of funding that's made available here in Hingham for the maintenance of the field. So it's a great point, and that will be part of the equation. Are we good for tonight? Any other thoughts or questions? Everybody's been extremely generous with their comments. It seems like everybody's pushing in the same direction in this room. And like I said before, I think there's a very compelling case to be made here. And we'll work with you to try to develop a series of recommendations that gets the town into a better spot. Mark, any last words of wisdom? We good to go? Stay tuned, stay connected. And we'll be doing another interaction where we're going to ask people to come out and probably comment on some of the recommendations that we're putting forward, and establishing priorities and phasing strategies, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, you're going to have to build support for capital improvements. And I think it's safe to say it's going to be significant. You know, it's not going to be like building a high school, but it has the chance to be significant. And certainly, you could say probably north of $10 million and maybe south of 20 million, but that's probably a range off the cuff at this point in time to really achieve some meaningful improvements across the system and then be better positioned to maintain those well-constructed and well-designed assets. So thanks very much for coming out tonight.